Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, look, the next of our what nows is Europe itself. After the French Revolution, other royal families worried about how to keep their heads, and there's perhaps a bit of that on the continent. And worry they might about keeping their jobs. If any Eurocrats were still harbouring dreams of creating a European superstate, Britain has shown that the old concept of the nation-state is not going down without a fight. And critically, there's now the looming question of what our relationship with the EU might be. Our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, is in Brussels. Good evening, Mark.
Evan, look, the thing that's defining attitudes here is a fear of contagion. Now, we heard Marine Le Pen, some Dutch Eurosceptics, others as well in Europe welcoming today's result, but none of them are in power right now. And none of them is in a position to deliver an in-out referendum in another European country anytime soon. But the attitude that seems to be dominant here, we've certainly heard some of the big hitters in the Brussels machine voice this attitude, is that Brexit should happen not just quickly, but in a very tough or exemplary way. In other words, they want the other countries in Europe that may be watching to see the Brits go out on very tough terms. Fascinating insight tonight from Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister, very influential. A leaked Brexit plan of his suggests trade terms and association agreement, not like Norway, as some people had been discussing in the UK, not like Switzerland, more the sort of deal that Turkey or Canada might be negotiating in the latter case. So very tough terms, all to do with trying to head off a risk which even last night almost nobody in this town really had got to grips with the idea was about to hit it.
Les Britanniques vont-ils claquer la porte de la Maison européenne?
Die deutsche Presse ist in ihrer Haltung zum Brexit sehr eindeutig.
In the city at the heart of the EU, they woke up to the day that ever closer union died.
Ja, det gör vi. Om ni ser bakom oss så har vi en bild på 10 Downing Street.
Across the airwaves and in many languages, that dread news sank in. With markets plunging across many countries, the woman styled Queen Europe by some called for calm.
Was die Folgen dieses Einschnitts in den nächsten Tagen, Wochen,
What the outcome of this watershed will mean to us in the coming days, weeks, months and years will depend on us. If we, the other 27 member states of the European Union, are capable and willing not to rush into any quick and easy decisions which would only further disunite Europe. But if we are capable and willing to assess the situation calmly and soberly in order to come to a joint decision on this basis.
At the Commission, leaders of the European institutions met to calibrate their response. And very soon it became clear that there would be no further offers to Britain.
We're already hearing voices here from the other 27 members of the EU that they should force the pace of Brexit in order to protect their own economies and political systems. And now we're going to hear from the bosses of the union's big institutions, and it'll be fascinating to see to what extent they think the union should drive a tough exit bargain with the UK.
For the man running the European bureaucracy, even the words to describe this moment seem to stick.
The British people express its views on their next situation. We now expect the United Kingdom government to give effect to this decision of the British people as soon as possible, however painful that process may be.
As for what it meant for the remaining 27, watch this.
Is this the beginning of the end of the European Union?
No. Thank you. Thank you all.
Blunt, but very much to the liking of the non-British journalists and officials. So Europe is in the deepest of crises as consultations begin prior to a Brussels summit next week. And there are already suggestions by many players here that any deal should be exemplary, with the UK denied access to the single market.
It's a consequence of the British vote, because the single market or the European Economic Area includes also the free movement of labour. That was the problem in the referendum. So I think that the only way to establish a new relationship between Britain and the European Union is using a trade agreement, like Europe has a trade agreements with a number of countries.
There's a statue just outside the Commission. It shows a step into the unknown. And on the day that the Brexit earthquake hit this town, it's rarely seemed more apt.
Mark Urban there. Well, earlier I was joined by Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's former Chief of Staff. Did he think the decision to leave was irreversible, or was there still a route he could see where Britain would retain some kind of membership of the EU?
Well, I think this was a vote against something rather than a vote for anything. It was a vote against our current relationship with the EU, but it wasn't a vote for what sort of new relationship we should have. So I must say, I think that David Cameron is right to delay the start of negotiations until there's a new Prime Minister. But I would go further than that. I think any new Prime Minister needs a mandate for a negotiation. He has to set out what he's for. What sort of new relationship are we going to have with the EU? Are we going to be Norway? Are we going to be Canada? Who are we going to be? And I think that's very, very important that they get that mandate from an election. So I don't think you can really start negotiations until there's been an election, not just the choice of a new Tory leader. OK, but that raises a lot of issues. So hang on, is it possible a party could go into an election saying, we're in, we're just going to ignore the referendum and we'll just negotiate us to remain? Of course you can. That's what elections are about. You go for an election in a mandate. One of the many reasons Mrs Thatcher was against referenda was because she thought you should decide this in representative democracy through an election. But the main point here is this is a vote against something. It's not a vote for something. The Brexiteers were completely divided on what they wanted. No one knows what they mean. So someone's got to set out a positive mandate and they've got to get a vote for it. Right. Now, look, a lot of the Europeans are saying they want this to happen quickly. The path you're describing, and indeed the path that the Leave campaign has been describing, is one that takes one that takes quite a lot of time. We're waiting months before the negotiation gets going. Do you think we can really keep our European partners waiting that long? I think we'll have to. I mean, David Cameron has already set out the timetable as far as he's concerned, and it's only us who can start Article 50, not them. So I totally understand why they want it to be quick, because the uncertainty is hurting them, not just us. But in the end, they're going to have to wait for us. And I think we would be sensible, A, to have a negotiating position, B, to have a new Prime Minister, and C, for that Prime Minister to have a mandate for what he's negotiating. This is really important about our future. Right. You can't just go in there, not clear what you want. Now, the other critical thing is how hardball do you think they're going to play with us? Because already we've heard reports of some saying the Norway option, forget it, you're not going to get the Norway option, that's not on the table, you are going to be properly out. Now, what do you think the European Union, what line will they take? How tough will they be? Well, they're not going to try and punish us because they want to have good relations with us. But the point is that they have their interests. They're going to meet at 27 without us next week to start working out what their position is. And their main priority is to keep the EU together. It's to stop the EU disintegrating. So they're not going to offer us anything that will encourage the Dutch or the Finns or the Danes to leave. So they're not going to offer us some super deal outside the EU, because otherwise they'll start losing other people. So that will be the last thing they do. They've got to take care of their interests, and we've got to fight for ours. Yeah. And bluffing, I mean, do you think there's been some bluff over the last few weeks in the run-up to the referendum? Well, I kind of hope so. If you remember, Boris Johnson said before he became the leader of the Brexit campaign, he said his preferred option would be to have a new negotiation and a new referendum, that the referendum would get us a better deal. So I'm hoping that he becomes leader of the Tory party, which I'm not hoping, but if he does, then he will have that mandate. He can go off, make a negotiation, and then have a new referendum. Remember, the Irish have done that twice this century. They voted against the treaty, had a second vote, and voted for it. Now, it seems very unlikely at the moment, the EU saying no to it, the Brexit campaign saying no to it, but that is one option when we go forward and when people realise quite how ghastly the alternatives are. We've been talking about Britain and its relationship with the EU. Let's just briefly talk about the EU itself. How dangerous is the British vote for other countries, for the existence of the EU? Well, it is a threat to the existence of the EU because it's going to encourage other Eurosceptics, and you can see who the friends of the Eurosceptics are. They're people like Le Pen, they're people like Trump. Those sort of people are going to be agitating to break Europe up, and of course the European governments are going to resist that, so it is a problem for them. Even leaving that aside, what's going to happen to Europe without Britain is it's going to become less liberal, it's going to become more integrated, and it's going to become more German. And that's going to worry lots of countries in Europe. That's why they wanted us to stay in. That's an inevitable consequence of us leaving.
Jonathan Powell there. Well, to pick up on that, I'm joined by the journalist and broadcaster, the French journalist and broadcaster, Christine Krent, and one of the leading lights of the Lead campaign, Dan Hannan. A very good evening to you. Christine, how does all of this look from France this evening?
Well, it looks pretty ghastly. But at the same time, listening in to the very interesting discussion you just had, Evan, I think you shouldn't underestimate the determination of the key member states on the continent not to let the Brits play the fiddle, determine the timetable, and, you know, we should just sit and wait for them to actually act. I think very much will depend on what happens on Monday when Madame Merkel meets in Berlin with François Hollande, the Italian Prime Minister, and Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council. I think that you will hear what the tone will be, and again, as has been said by our Brussels correspondent, there's that series of meetings next week. And again, you know, the European Union had been functioning for 17 years before Britain was accepted in. So I think there's a degree of arrogance at times, if I may, even at a late hour in the night.
Wouldn't be the first
sort of
time.
Thinking that we're going to disintegrate after this rather ghastly result.
Can I just push you? Sorry to interrupt. Can I push you? I mean, David Cameron is stepping down. It's going to take a good 2 or 3 months to elect a new Prime Minister, a new leader of the Conservative Party. No one really feels that David Cameron can do the negotiation. You're going to have to wait 3 months before this starts, aren't you?
Yes, but do you think that people in Brussels will just sit and wait? I think the process is going to be so complicated. The economic and financial costs, we've seen nothing today. Of course, the pound lost a great deal of value, and the markets will be shaken for quite some time. So I think there will be a lot of work being done in the meantime. And, you know, it's not going to be done by the snap of the finger. But again, I think on the continent, there's also this idea that the British people, especially the older generation, the ones who really have deprived the young ones of all the benefits of Europe, they are going to feel the brunt. And that is something which on the continent will be closely watched, especially by those Eastern European countries, which may, I remind you, Britain wanted so much inside the EU. Indeed. And now complains about immigration
Christine, let me put
from
your points,
Eastern Europe.
Let me put your points to Dan Hannan. Dan Hannan, firstly, they don't want us to take all this time and sit around thinking about it. They just want us to get on with it, and that's a perfectly reasonable request, isn't it?
Well, you've already answered that point, Evan. We have to wait until there's somebody to do the negotiation, so it can't start until that's taken place. I think getting this right matters much more than the time. And by getting it right, I mean being fair to our friends and allies on the continent, as well as getting a deal that is in our own interest. And it would be crazy to rush into something after 43 years at the expense of getting something that's mutually satisfactory.
Jonathan Powell said we need to have an election. You can't. We haven't yet worked out what the plan is, what the model is. Do you agree with that?
No. I mean, one of the reasons that Brussels is so unpopular is because it's seen to be contemptuous of public opinion. It swats aside referendums. It's incredible that less than 24 hours after the result, we've already got people trying to undo it. But what I would say, if I may sort of temper or soften what I've just said a little bit, although plainly we have a verdict that says that we are going to leave the European Union, it was a narrow majority. 48% of people voted to stay in. Yep. Scotland voted to stay
50-50,
in. Right. Northern Ireland, Gibraltar voted to stay in. We who are on the winning side have to be cognizant of the extent to which opinion is divided. We have to try and carry as many Remain voters with us. And that may well mean that quite a lot of the existing arrangements remain in place and that we try and find a status that both Leavers and Remainers can live with.
I've heard you talk about this, and it sounds like you, Daniel Hannan, I don't know whether you're speaking for Vote Leave or for Boris Johnson or for anybody else, it sounds like you are veering towards something closer to the Norway option as a compromise between the 48 and the 52 in the single market. Yeah?
Right. My issue with the EU has always been the lack of sovereignty, the lack of democracy. Of course there are economic issues as well. It wouldn't be exactly Norway, obviously. We're a very different country. We're 65 million rather than 5 million. But the idea of staying within a common market but outside the political integration, I think that is feasible, yes.
And that means free movement of people.
It means free movement of labour. It doesn't mean EU citizenship with all the acquired rights.
I'm sorry, we've just been through 3 months of agony on the issue of immigration, the public have been led to believe that what they have voted for is an end to free movement.
Here is a very, very important point. From the moment we joined, we had the right to take up a job offer in another member state. You had a legal entitlement if you presented your contract. Now, that changed with Maastricht. When EU citizenship was introduced, people were given legal entitlements to live in other countries, to vote in other countries, and to claim welfare and have the same university tuition and so on. That bit, I think, is going to change. That means that we can deport people.
Why didn't you say this in the campaign?
Listen,
Dan Hannan, why did you not say in the campaign that you were wanting a system, a scheme where we had free movement of labour? Come on, that is completely at odds with what the public think they have just voted for.
I have just spent 4 months addressing rallies virtually every day, and at every one I would say, do not imagine that if we leave the EU, that means zero immigration from the EU. It means we will have some control over who comes in and in what numbers.
You've given the impression, the words take back control.
It's all there on YouTube, you can see it all.
Your campaign has given the impression that we will not be able to get immigration down to tens of thousands if we're out inside the EU. I think most people would say that gives the impression we will get it down to tens of thousands if we're outside the EU.
No, we've always been clear. We want a measure of control. It will be for a future parliament to determine the numbers and to determine, how many students, how many doctors, how many family reunifications, whatever. But I don't think anyone's ever tried to put a number on it. That's obviously going to depend on the state of the economy at the time.
Dan Hannan, thank you very much. Christina Krent, thank you. I had meant to come back to you, Christine. We're out of time, but I hit a nerve there with Dan Hannan. Thank you so much. Thank you.